story begins on the night of April 10th in the bustling heart of New York City. Grayson Pierce, the 32-year-old CEO of Pierce Fragrances, a renowned perfume empire, stood amid a sea of elegantly dressed guests at a company event in Manhattan. The air hummed with conversation, the clink of champagne glasses, and the subtle waft of costly colognes. But Grayson felt distant, a stranger in his own world. For years, insomnia had plagued him, a relentless shadow that robbed him of rest. That night, someone slipped a drug into his drink, a malicious act meant to bring him down. As his vision blurred and his legs weakened, he stumbled into his office, collapsing onto the leather couch. Then, something remarkable happened. A gentle scent of vanilla washed over him, soft and soothing, wrapping around him like a warm embrace he couldn't quite place. His voice, faint and confused, broke the silence as he murmured, "Who was here? This scent, it's like a hug I've never known. Someone, say something," but no one replied. For the first time in years, he slipped into a deep, peaceful sleep, undisturbed until dawn painted the sky. The one who had saved him was Hazel Quinn, a 25-year-old janitor who worked the late shift at Pierce Fragrances. Hazel had been pushing her cleaning cart through the quiet hallways when she spotted Grayson slumped in the corridor, his breathing uneven. With quiet resolve, she pulled him into his office, shielding him from curious eyes. She left behind a handkerchief she'd made herself, infused with a vanilla scent from her modest experiments. As she slipped out into the night, she whispered softly to herself, "He's safe now. I don't need him to know who I am." She disappeared into the shadows, leaving no trace beyond that faint fragrance. When morning came, Grayson stirred awake, his mind clearer than it had been in ages. The scent still lingered, a mystery that gnawed at him. Who had been there? He couldn't let it go, that fleeting sense of peace he hadn't known he could feel. Grayson lived alone in a sleek penthouse high above the city, the skyline stretching out before him like a glittering promise he couldn't grasp. Pierce Fragrances flourished under his command, its luxurious bottles adorning shelves across the globe. Yet, beneath his sharp suits and confident demeanor, he was trapped, a man who couldn't escape the sleepless nights. His assistant, Henry, often found him at his desk in the early hours, eyes heavy with exhaustion. One morning, Grayson sighed and said to him, "Henry, I didn't sleep again last night. These expensive perfumes don't help at all." Henry, ever loyal, replied with concern, "Boss, you need rest. Pierce Fragrances can't lose you just because of insomnia." Grayson gave a bitter laugh and muttered, "Rest? I don't even know what that word means anymore." Across the city, Hazel Quinn lived a starkly different life. She spent her days cleaning the gleaming floors of Pierce Fragrances, a nearly invisible figure among the towering glass and steel. Her paycheck barely covered her rent in a cramped Brooklyn apartment, a harsh reminder of New York's unforgiving nature. But Hazel held on to something precious, a love for scents that went beyond her humble circumstance. In the quiet of her home, she mixed fragrances from whatever she could afford, filling the air with hints of lavender, citrus, and her favorite, vanilla. It was her escape, her dream, though others didn't see it that way. One day, as she polished a railing, a coworker smirked and said to her, "Hazel, you're too dreamy. A janitor like us don't belong in the perfume world." Hazel paused, her voice quiet but firm as she replied, "I love scents more than scrubbing floors, but this is how I survive in New York." Then, with a small smile, she added, "I don't need the whole world. I just want to make one scent." That night of April 10th was a turning point neither of them could have predicted. Grayson, a man surrounded by wealth and influence, stood at the pinnacle of success, yet felt hollow, his nights a battlefield he couldn't win. Hazel, a woman overlooked by most, carried a gift born of passion and resilience, a talent hidden beneath her worn uniform. The vanilla-scented handkerchief lay crumpled on his office floor, a fragile link between their worlds. In the days that followed, Grayson found himself distracted, replaying that night in his mind, the scent a whisper of something he couldn't name. He didn't realize it yet, but Hazel had given him more than a fleeting moment of rest. She had sparked a search, a flicker of hope in a life that had grown dim. Hazel, meanwhile, returned to her routine, her cart rattling through the silent halls of Pierce Fragrances, oblivious to the fact that destiny had already begun to weave their paths together. Their story was just starting, a tale of longing and discovery, bound by the delicate thread of a single fragrance. Days passed since that fateful night, but Grayson Pierce couldn't shake the memory of the vanilla scent that had granted him a rare moment of peace. He returned to his role as CEO of Pierce Fragrances with renewed determination, though his sleepless nights persisted. One evening, as the office lights dimmed and most employees had gone home, Grayson lingered in the building, restless and searching for answers. That's when he saw her. Hazel Quinn pushed her cleaning cart through the quiet halls, her movements steady and unassuming. She paused to wipe down a glass door, and a faint whiff of vanilla drifted toward him, stopping him in his tracks. His heart quickened as he stepped closer, his voice sharp with curiosity as he asked, "Who are you? I smell that vanilla again, just like that night. Have we met before?" Hazel froze, her hands tightening around the cloth. She glanced up at him, her tone soft but guarded as she replied, "I'm just a janitor, Mr. Pierce. Maybe you've mistaken me for someone else." Grayson shook his head, unconvinced, and pressed further. "No, I'm not mistaken. Do you want to try working with perfumes? I need a new project." Hazel hesitated, her eyes flickering with doubt. The offer seemed too sudden, too impossible for someone like her, but Grayson's intensity left little room for refusal. She agreed and soon found herself in a small lab within Pierce Fragrances, surrounded by vials and essences she'd only dreamed of touching. Days later, she presented her first creation, a fragrance woven from herbs that reminded her of childhood summers. She held the bottle out to Grayson, her voice trembling slightly as she explained, "This is something I made from herbs. It's not fancy, but it's from my memories." Grayson inhaled deeply, his expression shifting from curiosity to awe. He looked at her, his words firm and decisive as he declared, "You call this not fancy? It's incredible. Starting today, you're my assistant perfumer." Hazel blinked, caught off guard, and stammered, "I don't have a degree." "Are you sure? I don't want to let you down." Grayson smiled faintly, his tone softening as he reassured her, "I don't need degrees. I need talent, and you have it." From that moment, Hazel's world began to shift. She traded her mop for a lab coat, working late into the night alongside Grayson. He found excuses to keep her close, asking her to refine blends or discuss ideas long after the rest of the team had left. One evening, as they stood over a table of scattered bottles, he glanced at her and said, "Hazel, can you stay late tonight? I want to talk more about this scent." She nodded, adjusting a dropper, and replied quietly, "Sure, but I'm not great at talking to people like you." Grayson raised an eyebrow, intrigued, and asked, "People like me? What do you mean?" Hazel's cheeks flushed as she looked away, her voice barely above a whisper as she admitted, "I mean, you're the CEO, and I'm just someone who cleans floors." Those words hung between them, a quiet confession of the chasm she felt. Grayson didn't respond right away, but something stirred in him, a flicker of warmth he hadn't expected. He began to notice how her presence changed things. On nights when Hazel stayed late, he slept better, the insomnia that had tormented him easing just enough to let him rest. He couldn't explain it, didn't dare question it too closely, but he felt drawn to her in a way that went beyond her talent. Hazel, meanwhile, poured herself into her work, her confidence growing with each new fragrance she crafted. Yet she couldn't shake the sense that she didn't belong. She watched Grayson from the corner of her eye, his sharp jawline and steady hands as he tested her blends, and wondered why someone like him would notice. Their time together deepened, subtle moments weaving a thread of connection. One night, as rain tapped against the lab windows, Grayson handed her a vial and asked her to adjust it. Their fingers brushed, and Hazel pulled back quickly, her breath catching. Grayson noticed, but said nothing, his gaze lingering on her a moment longer than necessary. She filled the silence with small talk about scents, her voice steadying as she described the notes she loved. He listened, captivated not just by her words, but by the way her eyes lit up when she spoke of her craft. For Hazel, those late hours were a strange mix of comfort and unease. She felt safe in the lab, surrounded by the tools of her passion, but Grayson's attention unsettled her. He was a man who commanded boardrooms and built empires, while she was a janitor who'd stumbled into his world by chance. The more they worked together, the more Grayson found himself seeking her out. He'd walk by her station just to catch that faint vanilla scent, a quiet reminder of the night she'd saved him. Hazel noticed his glances, the way he'd pause as if wanting to say more, and it stirred something in her, a hope she didn't dare name. Yet she kept her distance, her words measured, afraid of what might happen if she let herself believe this was more than a job. One afternoon, as they reviewed a new blend, Grayson leaned closer, his voice low as he murmured, "This one's good, Hazel. You're better at this than anyone I've met." She smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, and replied, "Thanks, Mr. Pierce. I just try my best." He chuckled softly and said, "Call me Grayson. Mr. Pierce makes me feel old." That small exchange marked a shift, a crack in the wall between them. Hazel began to see him not just as the untouchable CEO, but as a man who carried his own burdens. Grayson, in turn, saw beyond her humble roots to the brilliance she brought to his company, and to him. Their conversations grew easier, laced with quiet laughter and shared ideas, though neither spoke of the tension building beneath the surface. For Grayson, Hazel was becoming more than an employee, her presence a balm to his restless nights. For Hazel, Grayson was a mystery she couldn't unravel, a man who saw her when no one else had. Their worlds, once so far apart, were drawing closer, pulled together by the fragile magic of scent and the unspoken feelings blooming in the quiet moments they shared. Weeks turned into months, and the bond between Grayson Pierce and Hazel Quinn deepened in the quiet corners of Pierce Fragrances. Their late-night sessions in the lab had become a ritual, a space where scents and silences spoke louder than words. One crisp autumn day, Grayson suggested a trip to the Adirondack Mountains, a rugged expanse north of New York, to gather wild herbs for a new fragrance. Hazel agreed, her curiosity outweighing her nerves. They drove through winding roads, the air sharp with pine and earth, until they reached a secluded trail. As they walked, Hazel bent to pluck a sprig of thyme, her fingers brushing the soil. Suddenly, Grayson grabbed her arm and pulled her back, his voice urgent as he shouted, "Hazel, watch out! There's a snake right there!" Hazel stumbled into him, her heart racing, and gasped, "Grayson, are you okay? Why did you push me?" He steadied her, his hands lingering on her shoulders, and said softly, "I don't promise you the whole world, Hazel, but I promise I'll give my whole world to keep you safe." Her breath caught, and she whispered, "Don't say that. I don't know how to answer you." The moment lingered, heavy with unspoken feelings as they stood beneath the towering trees. Hazel turned away first, focusing on the herbs, but Grayson watched her, his chest tight with something he couldn't name. They returned to the city with baskets of ingredients and a new closeness, their laughter echoing in the lab as they blended their harvest into a fragrance that felt like theirs alone. Yet, as their connection grew, shadows began to creep into their world. Abigail Foster, the ambitious managing director of Pierce Fragrances, had been watching from afar. She'd found Hazel's vanilla-scented handkerchief after that night in April and kept it, a tool for her own plans. One day she cornered Grayson in his office, holding the cloth out with a calculated smile. Her voice dripped with confidence as she said, "Grayson, don't you remember? I was the one who saved you that night. This handkerchief is mine." Grayson frowned, taking it from her, and replied, "This handkerchief? I'm not sure, Abigail. Something feels off." She stepped closer, insistent, and pressed, "You doubt me? I only want what's best for you and Pierce Fragrance." Grayson didn't trust her, but Abigail's words planted a seed of confusion. She wanted him, not just as a colleague, but as a prize, a stepping stone to power. Meanwhile, another threat loomed within Grayson's own family. His stepmother, Evelyn Pierce had long resented his control over the company. She summoned him to the family estate one evening, her tone cold as she declared, "Grayson, Lucas will take over as CEO. You've embarrassed this company long enough." Grayson's younger brother, Lucas, stood nearby, his face tense. Before Grayson could respond, Lucas interrupted, his voice steady as he said, "Mother, I don't want to be CEO. I love Daniel, and am going to live my truth." Evelyn's eyes widened, her anger flaring as she snapped, "Lucas, are you mad? You're ruining everything I planned." The confrontation left Grayson unsettled, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Hazel. She was becoming his anchor, a light in the storm of his life. Yet Hazel felt the weight of doubt pressing down on her. She'd seen Abigail lingering near Grayson, her polished elegance a stark contrast to Hazel's simple presence. One afternoon, as they tested a new scent, Hazel's voice trembled as she asked, "Grayson, Abigail says she's the one you need. Am I just a mistake?" Grayson turned to her, his eyes intense, and replied, "Hazel, don't listen to her. I need you more than anyone." His words steadied her, but the unease lingered, a quiet ache she couldn't shake. Abigail's schemes grew bolder. She whispered lies to colleagues, hinting that Hazel was an opportunist, a nobody trying to climb the ranks. Hazel overheard the gossip one day, her hands pausing over a vial as the words cut deep. She wanted to confront Abigail, but instead, she buried herself in her work, letting her fragrances speak for her. Grayson noticed her silence, the way she avoided his gaze, and tried to draw her out. One evening, as they sat alone in the lab, he handed her a sample and said, "Hazel, this one's perfect. You make everything better." She managed a small smile and murmured, "Thanks, Grayson. I'm just doing my job." He leaned closer, his voice gentle as he teased, "You're more than a job to me. You know that, right?" Hazel's heart fluttered, but she didn't reply, afraid of what it might mean. Their connection was undeniable now, a thread pulled taut between them. Grayson found himself seeking her out more often, drawn to her quiet strength, her way of seeing beauty in the smallest things. He'd catch himself watching her as she worked, her fingers deft and sure, and wonder how she'd slipped so easily into his life. Hazel felt it too, the pull toward him, but she couldn't silence the voice that whispered she didn't belong. She'd grown up with nothing, scraping by in a world that rarely gave second chances, while Grayson had been born into privilege, his name etched in gold. One rainy night, as they stood by the lab window, Grayson reached for her hand, his touch tentative. Hazel didn't pull away this time, her eyes meeting his in the dim light. He spoke softly, his voice barely above the sound of the rain. "You're not just someone who cleans floors, Hazel. You're the best things happened to me." She swallowed hard, her reply a whisper. "I want to believe you, Grayson. I really do." The air between them thickened, charged with a longing neither could deny. But beyond the lab's walls, Abigail and Evelyn watched, their plans tightening like a noose. Abigail wanted Grayson for herself, and Evelyn wanted him gone, their ambitions threatening to unravel everything he and Hazel had built. Love was blooming, fragile and fierce, but it would soon face a test neither of them could foresee. The fragrance Grayson and Hazel had crafted together was ready, a masterpiece born of their shared moments in the Adirondacks. Pierce Fragrances planned a grand launch, the event buzzing with anticipation in the company's sleek Manhattan headquarters. Guests mingled under chandeliers, their voices a hum beneath the clatter of glasses, but tension simmered beneath the surface. Abigail Foster, driven by jealousy and ambition, had tampered with the display, rigging a machine to overload. As Hazel unveiled the scent, a sharp hiss cut through the air, followed by a deafening explosion. Flames licked the walls and screams erupted. Hazel stumbled back, her eyes wide with shock, and cried out, "Grayson, watch out, the machine's going to blow!" Grayson lunged toward her, his voice raw as he shouted, "Hazel, run! I'll hold it back!" He shoved her out of harm's way just as a blast threw him against a table, his body crumpling to the floor. Hazel scrambled to his side, her hands shaking as she clutched his arm and sobbed. "Grayson, don't leave me. I can't live without you." Blood streaked his face, but Grayson's eyes flickered open, finding hers through the haze. Security rushed in, dousing the flames, and paramedics carried him away, leaving Hazel trembling in the chaos. Abigail watched from the sidelines, her expression unreadable, but her plan had only begun. She saw Hazel as a threat, a rival who'd stolen Grayson's heart and the spotlight she craved. Days later, as Grayson recovered in the hospital, Abigail made her move. She hired men to abduct Hazel, luring her to a derelict warehouse in Brooklyn under the pretense of a delivery. Bound and blindfolded, Hazel sat in the cold, her pulse racing as Abigail stepped forward, her voice icy as she sneered. "Hazel, you think you deserve Grayson? You're nothing. Tonight you disappear." Hazel lifted her chin, defiance in her tone as she shot back. "Abigail, you win. But Grayson will never love you." The words stung, fueling Abigail's rage, but before she could act, Grayson burst through the warehouse doors, his bandages still fresh from the hospital. He'd tracked Hazel by the faint vanilla scent she always carried, a beacon in his desperation. His voice thundered as he demanded, "Hazel, don't touch her, Abigail. Let her go now." Abigail froze, her hired men scattering as Grayson advanced, his strength defying his injuries. He untied Hazel, pulling her into his arms, her tears soaking his shirt. The police arrived soon after, dragging Abigail away in handcuffs, her schemes unraveling in the dim light. But Grayson needed more than her arrest. He needed the truth about that night in April, the night that had changed everything. Back at Pierce Fragrances, Grayson summoned Henry to his office, his tone urgent as he said, "Henry, check the security footage from April 10th. I need to know what really happened." Henry nodded, pulling up the grainy video on a screen. They watched in silence as the footage revealed Hazel dragging Grayson into his office, her figure small but determined, while Abigail appeared nowhere near the scene. Henry turned to him, his voice steady as he confirmed, "Boss, it was Hazel all along that night. Abigail wasn't there." Grayson's jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on the screen. Abigail, cornered by the evidence, collapsed into a chair, her defiance crumbling as she stammered, "No, I just wanted you, Grayson. I didn't mean to hurt anyone." The truth hit Grayson like a wave, washing away the doubts Abigail had sown. Hazel had been the one from the beginning, the quiet savior who'd given him peace when he'd had none. He turned to her, standing silently by his side, and took her hand, his grip firm but gentle. She looked up at him, her eyes red from tears, and he saw not just the janitor who'd stumbled into his life, but the woman who'd changed it. The explosion, the abduction, all of it had tested them, but they'd emerged stronger, bound by a love forged in fire. Abigail's betrayal had nearly torn them apart, yet it had also laid bare the depth of what they meant to each other. In the hospital later that night, Grayson lay in his bed, his breathing steady as Hazel sat beside him, her fingers tracing the edge of his bandage. He reached for her, his voice hoarse but certain as he murmured, "You saved me again, Hazel. You always do." She shook her head, a faint smile breaking through her exhaustion, and replied, "I just couldn't lose you, Grayson, not after everything." Their hands clasped tighter, a silent vow in the sterile room. The chaos had stripped away pretense, leaving only the raw truth of their feelings. Abigail's schemes had failed, but they'd nearly cost Grayson the one person who mattered most. Now, with the lies exposed and the danger past, they faced a future uncertain, but together, their love a quiet strength that no fire or deception could extinguish. The hospital room was quiet, the hum of machines a soft backdrop to the storm that had finally passed. Grayson Pierce lay in his bed, his wounds bandaged but his spirit unbroken, while Hazel Quinn sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on his. The chaos of the explosion and Abigail's betrayal had left them battered, but it had also forged something unshakable between them. As dawn broke, casting pale light through the window, Grayson stirred, his eyes finding Hazel's. She leaned closer, her voice trembling with relief as she said, "Grayson, you're awake. I was so afraid I'd lose you. You're my home, everything I've ever dreamed of." He managed a weak smile, his fingers tightening around hers, and replied hoarsely, Hazel, I heard you calling me. I couldn't leave you, not ever. Their reunion was tender, a moment of stillness after months of turmoil. Hazel stayed by his side through his recovery, bringing him small vials of her latest scents to test, their laughter filling the sterile air. Grayson healed quickly, his strength returning with each day, and soon he was back on his feet, determined to give Hazel the future she deserved. Weeks later, he drove her back to the Adirondack Mountains, the place where their love had taken root. They stood on a ridge overlooking the vast expanse of green, the wind carrying the scent of pine and earth. Grayson turned to her, his voice steady and warm as he said, "Hazel, this is the Adirondacks. I bought it for you so you can create perfumes forever. Be my wife. Let me love you for the rest of my life. Will you?" Hazel's eyes widened, her breath catching at the enormity of his gift and his words. She stepped closer, her hands resting on his chest, and replied softly, "Grayson, I don't need mountains, I just need you. Yes, I'll marry you." He pulled her into his arms, their embrace sealing a promise that felt eternal. The mountains stretched out before them, a canvas for Hazel's dreams, but it was Grayson's presence that made it all real. They lingered there, the world fading away, lost in the quiet joy of their commitment. Back in New York, life settled into a new rhythm. Abigail faced justice, her schemes exposed, while Evelyn retreated, her plans to replace Grayson with Lucas crumbling. Lucas, free to live his truth with Daniel, sent Grayson a simple note of thanks, a gesture that mended old wounds. Pierce Fragrances thrived under Grayson's leadership, bolstered by Hazel's brilliance. She took her place not just as his assistant, but as his partner, her fragrances becoming the heart of the company's success. One evening, as they stood in the lab where it all began, Grayson wrapped an arm around her and said, "Well, have kids, Hazel, a whole family, building this dream together." She looked up at him, her smile radiant, and replied, "I never thought a floor scrubber like me could have this happiness. Thank you, Grayson." Their wedding was small, held in the Adirondacks under a canopy of trees, surrounded by the scents they both loved. Hazel wore a simple dress, a sprig of thyme tucked into her hair, while Grayson stood tall beside her, his eyes never leaving her face. They vowed to stand by each other through every storm and every sunrise, their love a quiet force that had overcome every obstacle. As they danced under the stars, the vanilla scent Hazel always carried mingled with the cool mountain air, a reminder of the night that had brought them together. Grayson and Hazel built more than a marriage in the years that followed. They created a legacy, blending their talents to craft perfumes that told their story, a tale of resilience, discovery, and devotion. The Adirondacks became their retreat, a place where they dreamed of children running through the fields, their laughter echoing among the trees. Hazel, once invisible in the halls of Pierce Fragrances, now stood at its heart, her name alongside Grayson's on every bottle they produced. Their love had begun with a single scent, a fleeting moment of peace in a sleepless night, and it had grown into something vast, a bond that time couldn't erode. Together they faced the future, hand in hand, a janitor and a CEO who'd found their truest selves in each other.